Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the National Social Anxiety Center, my name is Shmuel Fischler. I am a clinical social worker. I am a board member of the National Social Anxiety Center, otherwise known as NSAC, and director of one of the regional clinics, which is CBT Baltimore, a bit north of Baltimore. So we welcome you to another installment in the series of interviews that NSAC has done with researchers around the country and internationally to try to bring to you some insight and perspective from the researchers themselves, certainly focused on the area of social anxiety. So today we are fortunate to have Dr. Lebowitz, and I've been fortunate to be in a training with Dr. Lebowitz and found it super useful and practical in my practice, and I'm sure whoever's watching is gonna benefit from it as well. So I'll do a brief introduction, and then Dr. Lebowitz can add or not add whatever he likes to any introduction. So Dr. Lebowitz is a child and adolescent psychologist and director of the Yale Child Study Center's Anxiety and Mood Disorders program. His research focuses on the development, neurobiology, and treatment of anxiety and related disorders, with special emphasis on cross-generational and familial influences in these disorders. Lebowitz is the lead investigator on multiple research projects and is the author of numerous research papers and books, the newest one, which I have sitting right here, and chapters on childhood and adolescent anxiety. He also developed a parent-based treatment program, which we're going to focus a lot on today, for children and adolescents with anxiety, OCD, and related problems called SPACE, which stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. SPACE has been tested and found to be effective in randomized controlled clinical trials. Thank you, Dr. Lebowitz, for being here with us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So I think for the people watching, whether it's lay people or clinicians or other researchers, I think a good place to start is a brief introduction for those who don't know of what the SPACE, not to be confused with NASA, what the SPACE treatment approach is, and then we'll get more focused on social anxiety.
Sure. Well, SPACE, which, as you noted, stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions, is an entirely parent-based treatment for child anxiety, for child OCD, meaning that although it's a therapy aimed at improving these disorders in children, it really requires only the direct participation of parents in treatments. So rather than typical therapy as you might imagine it, you bring your child to the session and maybe you drop them off, and another psychologist or a clinician, social worker, et cetera, might work with them for an hour. Here, it's the parents meeting with the therapist and learning and really being empowered to help their child overcome even serious anxiety or related problems. And that's really what SPACE is about.
Right. And I found it to be very unique in that regard, is that it's liberating that you really don't need the buy-in from the child. And sometimes that's really necessary for many pragmatic reasons that you struggle to have the buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll get into the minutia of SPACE soon, but let's backtrack, and we're going to try to focus on some of the research. So when did this start to even become a thought, an idea, and then that turned into different research that brought it more to life? How did this all start?
Well, that's a great question. Kind of where does this come from? And there's really a few. There's a few answers, I guess, that I could give to that. One of them really goes back to a time now, many years ago, when I was working in a large children's hospital. And at that point, I was actually working in two programs at the same time, two clinics. One of them was a clinic that did cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, for child anxiety. And the other was a clinic that did parent guidance for serious externalizing behavior problems. So like conduct problems, truancy, aggression, delinquency, things like that. And in the parent guidance program, as the name suggests, we really work directly with parents. And that's common in the externalizing problem world, because children who are having those kinds of problems are not always ideal candidates for direct therapy themselves. Their motivation might be very low, and getting them to participate in treatment is an obvious challenge. Now, in the anxiety program, where we did cognitive behavioral therapy with kids, one of my jobs was to screen incoming families on the phone and try to make a guess about whether or not they would be good candidates for cognitive behavioral therapy. Because the truth is, we had more patients than we could handle. We had a bit of a wait list, and so we wanted to sort of do some screening early in the process. And one question that I became accustomed to asking families on the phone was, does your child want treatment? And if they said no, I would explain to them that cognitive behavioral therapy requires a lot of motivation from kids, and if the child doesn't really want therapy, it's probably not going to work. And I think this is similar to what a lot of other therapists do in a lot of other places. But I really became increasingly frustrated, because on the same day, I might be having that call with a parent of a child with anxiety or OCD and telling them, if your child doesn't want help, we're not really going to be able to help you. And on that same day, I might be meeting with the parent of a child with these serious externalizing problems and saying, we don't need your kid to come. We're going to give you the tools. We're going to help you. And I just felt like this is ridiculous. Why is there nothing that we can offer to parents of children with anxiety, with internalizing problems like anxiety and OCD? Why are we not able to help them if their child doesn't want help? And that was one of the things that really drove me to think more about the role of parents in these disorders. And another thing was just in my work with parents, I just saw how deeply entangled they became in their children's anxiety problems and how drawn in they were. And there was so little data to actually empirically guide what should a clinician do about that, right? Like our model for how to treat these problems didn't really address that. And so that also led me to think a lot about how we can understand parents' involvement in these disorders and what we can offer to parents of children who have these problems, whether or not the child really wants direct therapy themselves. So that's a little bit of where this actually comes from, I guess.
Great, thank you. And so then that turned into, so when did the research actually start, and what did the research start to tell you?
Yeah, so, I came to the Yale Child Study Center. It's now about 11 years ago. And I was very interested already in these areas because the experience that I described before happened prior to that. And I learned about a body of research is specific to obsessive compulsive disorder. And that was research on a phenomenon called family accommodation. What it really describes is ways in which parents and other caregivers might be changing their behavior to help their relative, who could be a child or even an adult, to help their relative not experience the distress related to their disorder. Now, this was really interesting to me because it seemed to capture so much of what I was seeing outside of OCD as well in other anxiety problems, where parents were describing to me how sometimes their whole household seemed to be revolving around a child with separation anxiety, for example, or a child with generalized anxiety, or other problems, or social anxiety, and how deeply involved everyone in the family might become in this child's social anxiety. For example, maybe this child has social anxiety. The sibling is not allowed to have play dates at home because it would make the socially anxious child uncomfortable. Or they don't go to events because it will make this child uncomfortable. And so I was curious, what does the research say on accommodation outside of OCD? And what I discovered was that the answer was nothing. There was no research on accommodation outside of obsessive compulsive disorder. And so we started doing that research. In 2013, we published the very first systematic study of accommodation outside of OCD, looking across the other anxiety disorders. And one of the most gratifying things in my professional life is just how quickly this concept of accommodation has become a central feature, a well-recognized and established central feature in anxiety disorders across the whole range of anxiety disorders. There are now hundreds of studies of accommodation from all over the world, and we've learned a lot about it, right? We've learned that this is incredibly prevalent. Almost every parent of a child with an anxiety problem engages in these kinds of accommodations frequently. And we've learned that the accommodations, although they're well-intentioned, are actually not that helpful over time. And that parents who accommodate more don't end up with a child who's less anxious as a result, but often end up with a child who's even more anxious, which is incredibly frustrating because they're putting in so much effort and time and resources, sometimes even money, into all these accommodations. And that really informed the treatment, because one of the goals of SPACE, I know we'll get more into like what SPACE is about, but one of the goals of SPACE as a treatment is actually to help parents to make a change in this domain of accommodation and to systematically reduce those accommodations.
Thank you. So definitely very, very prevalent. So, you know, this research obviously demonstrates the significant role of accommodation. Did the research show at all, were there any differences? Because I know a large part of our audience is focused on social anxiety. Were there any nuanced differences between social anxiety disorder and other disorders, you know, through your research?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one that we are continuing to study, and research in this area remains very active, so we're learning more things all the time. If we were to pick one disorder within the anxiety disorders that is likely the most linked to accommodation, it's probably actually going to be separation anxiety disorder, not social anxiety disorder. And that's partly because it's frankly hard to imagine having separation anxiety disorder without a lot of accommodation, right? If the main characteristic of the disorder is reliance on parental presence and proximity and resistance of separation, well, it's so the parent part of it is so ingrained that it's actually almost unimaginable that somebody would have serious separation anxiety disorder without parent involvement in some way. Like, how would that even work? And so, so that one, if there's one that stands out, it's that. But the truth of the matter is that we're talking about subtle differences because accommodation is incredibly prevalent across all the anxiety disorders. When I say incredibly prevalent, just to give people a sense of what I mean, I'm talking about somewhere between 97 and 100% of parents who have a child with an anxiety disorder reporting frequent, usually daily, accommodations.
Wow.
I mean, it's hard to think of a question that 100% of parents would agree about, right? We don't agree about anything. But if you have an anxious child, you probably agree that you accommodate and probably accommodate frequently. So yeah, maybe separation could be a little bit higher and another one could be a little bit lower, but the truth of the matter is these are subtle differences, and the rule stands, like, if you have a child with anxiety, you're probably accommodating.
Right, and for a lot of parents, it's like they're doing this like cost benefit. You know, they think it's going to create a lot more distress in the short term. So, you know, what accommodating is easier in the short term. You know, that's so. And then, you know, so piggybacking off of that, then have you been able to delineate? You know, it's pretty significant accommodation. So I'll be very curious how much contributes to the impact of a disorder from accommodation versus we'll call it the organic disorder itself. Like if I mean, obviously through the treatment, so then we reduce the accommodation, it helps the child. So does that mean to say that the accommodation is, not to throw parents under the bus, but is accommodation like even more responsible than the initial organic development of social anxiety or any other of these anxiety disorders?
Well, it's a really interesting question, but let me say first, and you said not to throw parents under the bus, and I want to pick that up and really emphasize it, actually, because it's an incredibly important point. And if you'll allow me, like just a really brief digression, I'll say, I think we as a field, and when I say we, I mean mental health, to include psychology, to include psychiatry, to include social work, no offense. We as a field have a very rich history and a frankly shameful history of blaming parents for children's problems. this has happened across the board. And we can point to so many examples. Parents have been blamed for schizophrenia, the schizoprenogenic mother, this is the classic theory. Autism, the refrigerator mother. And we could go on. The fact of the matter is that time and again, empirical research actually fails to support these theories. I do not know any serious researchers today who believe in the schizoprenogenic mother theory or the refrigerator mother theory. I don't think they don't hold water. They don't stand up to empirical testing. But I think it's important to acknowledge that history, and we have to be extra cautious when we talk about the role of parents. And I want to be really clear that space is focused on parents and on the role of parents, but it's not because I think parents are the cause of children's anxiety disorders. In fact, I would say really emphatically that in the vast majority of cases, with very few exceptions, parents are not the cause of children's anxiety problems. Exceptions include things like parents who are severely abusive, neglectful, who maltreat their children. Those things are awful, and they can have serious detrimental impacts on a child's mental health. So don't do those things. But that is not the story for the vast majority of children who have an anxiety disorder, where actually their innate predisposition is the main driver. Now, with that being said, the fact remains that what the research is telling us is that once you have a child with that predisposition, that's not your fault. But once you have a child with that predisposition, with that vulnerability, how you respond does matter. Just like if you have a child with a physical illness, if your child got diagnosed with diabetes, you didn't give it to them. That's not your fault. Don't blame yourself. But what you do is going to matter. And your child could have a better course or a worse course because they are dependent on you in many ways, and your behavior is going to impact the course of their problem. And so the research definitely does support that that family accommodation, which is inherently a response to a child's anxiety problem. So it can't be the cause, right? Because if your child wasn't anxious in the first place, you're not accommodating. You may be overly protective, but you're not accommodating, right? Accommodation is inherently a response. And what the research tells us is that high levels of accommodation can exacerbate anxiety, can predict worse anxiety over time, can maintain anxiety over time rather than the opposite. I think the specific question that you asked is very hard to answer for an individual child, right? Like the relative weight of how strongly predisposed this child is to anxiety and the myriad other factors in the child's life versus the specific impact of the accommodation, I think is going to be very hard to parse for any particular child. We know both things are important. And we know that accommodation is something parents can choose to change, whereas your child's innate vulnerability is something you actually can't choose to change. And so it makes a lot of sense for us to put effort into trying to address the parts that we can actually do something about.
Focusing on what we can control versus what we can't.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I appreciate everything you said about that. It can be easy to fall into blaming the parents, especially if our focus now is helping parents, but it's helping parents, not blaming parents.
Exactly.
So throughout doing all this research and developing this treatment approach, does that change at all how you conceptualize anxiety disorders and social anxiety? Is it like, if there was previously how you have a case conceptualization of, presentation of anxiety, does this change how you conceptualize it?
Oh, I think it absolutely does. I think it absolutely does, deeply. In fact, I would say that once you start thinking about child anxiety in the way that I think about it, or that we think about it in space, it never looks the same. And here's what I mean. What is the basic underlying model that has informed our understanding and our treatment of child anxiety over decades? Many of your listeners probably know the answer to this. It is the classic, what is called the tripartite model of anxiety, meaning a model that focuses on the child's thoughts, the child's behavior, and the child's physiology, right? Their maladaptive thoughts, thinking traps, their behavior, their avoidance, and the physical dysregulation. That is actually the exact same model that informs our understanding of adult anxiety disorders. And our treatments over the past decades, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, which to be clear is a wonderful treatment, which I both teach and practice, our treatments build on that model and in fact are also the same for children and for adults. CBT for a child with social anxiety is essentially the same as CBT for an adult with social anxiety, though of course we explain it differently. When we're talking to a child, we use different words, we tailor it for the developmental stage of the patient. But the basic model is the same. Now, what that model leaves out is the fact that actually child anxiety is meaningfully different from adult anxiety. And the way that it's different has to do with the fact that children are naturally hardwired, literally at the neurological level, and which is also research that we're engaged in is actually understanding this neurological infrastructure. But the basic point is children are hardwired to respond to anxiety, to fear and distress in a way that's different from adults. If an adult is scared, the classic fight or flight response drives them to either approach the threat with aggression or to flee the threat with fear, right? When a child, an infant, a baby, or a child is scared, their response is actually not entirely about approach and flight. It's about signaling somebody else. It's about letting their parent know, I have a problem. Because we are born not really good at flight or fight, right? Babies are not really good at this. So what do babies do from the day that they're born? When they're scared, they let somebody else know so that that person, usually a parent, can step in and do the fight for them and help them by regulating them and soothing them once the threat has been averted. Meaning that in children, anxiety is actually a social phenomenon. It's an interpersonal phenomenon that involves me, the child, letting my parent know I'm scared, and you, the parent, stepping in to help me. This is really different from adults, and it is not really captured in the model that has informed our treatments over decades, but is deeply captured in space. Because if you think about accommodation, what is accommodation? It's the parent side of that constant triggering of the social aspect of child anxiety. I'm a child, I'm scared, I come to you, my parent, to help me with this situation. You step in and help me. For a child with social anxiety, what does that look like? We're at the restaurant, the waiter's talking to me, I'm uncomfortable, I don't want to answer. It makes me feel embarrassed. What if I get it wrong? What do? I look to my parent, I point at the menu, you order for me, right? You tell the waiter what I want. When he asks what I want to drink, I whisper it in your ear, you tell him what I want to drink. That's the child social aspect of anxiety playing out in just a normal day-to-day kind of situation, of which for a child with a disorder, there are thousands, right? That is happening thousands of times. So bottom line, to answer your question, I think once we start looking at child anxiety through this interpersonal lens, it deeply changes our whole understanding of these problems and then informs a whole other set of possible intervention strategies.
Wow, that's very insightful for me. Yeah, and maybe I should have paid more attention at the. That's a really great. That's a really big shift, because inherently nothing inherently wrong with the CBT model, but when it's applied to this, it's a whole different perspective on how to approach it. A couple more questions on the research, and then we'll get into the components of space. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'm not even going to pronounce this right, about the hormones? You did the research on the, how do you pronounce it?
I think the word you're looking for is neurohypophyseal hormones, probably.
Can you talk just a little bit about that and what we learned from that?
Sure. I've even in this brief conversation that we've had, I've already used terms like children are hardwired some way, or parents are wired a certain way. And I use those words literally because we're talking about biological infrastructure that drives these patterns of accommodation, of of child signaling, of parent responding, of fear in general. And so if we are programmed to respond a certain way, there has to be biological infrastructure to maintain that. It can't just be magic, right? It has to actually be built into our biology in some way, into our brain or some physiological system. And so we've been very interested in studying, the relevant neurobiological systems to better understand this. And one area has focused on the hormone and neurotransmitter oxytocin, which is a neurohypophyseal hormone. Oxytocin, many people will have heard about oxytocin, and that is partly because it's become quite famous in the world as a kind of love hormone, if you will, because it is deeply involved in interpersonal behavior, in close attachment behavior, be that romantic, sexual, or other kinds of bonds like parent-child bonds. Oxytocin is very deeply involved in regulating our social functioning. But it's also, excuse me, it's also deeply involved in regulating our anxiety. And it actually makes sense. Once we start thinking about anxiety in the way that we've been talking about it, as this interpersonal phenomenon, it actually makes sense that there would be a biological system that straddles social regulation and anxiety regulation, because we're saying that at least in children, anxiety is a social phenomenon. And so we've been studying oxytocin in children and parents with anxiety disorders. And what we've learned is that there are some direct links between levels of oxytocin that you can measure, for example, in the saliva of a child with anxiety, and the level of family accommodation that that family reports on a scale like the family accommodation scale for anxiety, or levels in the parents. And in fact, in one of our most recent papers, we're even finding that levels of oxytocin measured before treatment are predictive of who is going to respond best to an individual child-based therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy and a parent-based therapy like SPACE. And I think we need a lot more research before we're able to translate that into a direct clinical recommendation. But I think it's fascinating and giving us really important clues into some of this biological infrastructure, and maybe to a future where we can have more precise treatment recommendations based on a variety of factors, including even biological factors.
Wow, that's fascinating. So maybe sometime in the future, before a parent decides on a course of treatment, take the saliva test and say, okay, you go to door number 1, you go to door number 2. This is going to be the individual treatment. This is going to be the parent-based treatment.
Wouldn't that be cool?
That would be super cool. Wow, and we'd save families a boatload of money.
Exactly.
It's money, making it more accessible.
It's money, it's frustration, it's so many resources. Being able to improve your first guess of which treatment to try first is incredibly valuable, because not everybody is going to be willing or able to do a second guess if the first one didn't work out.
Right. It reminds me, I don't want to go off too much on a tangent. It reminds me, and I've heard sort of differing opinions on the genetic testing for psychotropic medications, and if that helps sort of make that first or second guess more accurate.
Exactly.
One more question on the research. Have you, during the research, what kind of cultural or background, historical, family background nuances or differences have you found in doing this research for anxiety disorders, and maybe if you have something specific for social anxiety, what kind of differences in either how it presents or how they respond or how they accommodate maybe throughout the research?
Yeah, it's actually a really important question, and being sensitive to cultural differences is incredibly important in this kind of research, or in research in general, but it's incredibly important in this kind of research where we're trying to understand familial patterns of behavior, and falling into the trap of kind of superimposing your cultural context, the family you happen to grow up in or the country you happen to grow up in, on other people's context is always going to be a mistake, which is both unfair to your research subjects, but also going to give you bad information.
Right.
And so And so I think it's an important consideration. Now, we know from studying accommodation across the world, really around the globe, we know that levels of accommodation are quite similar across the world. And so, we have data on accommodation from really many different places in the United States, but also many places in South America and Canada, and also countries in the Middle East, and also countries in Asia, like India and China and Japan and Singapore and others, and countries and Australia. And so we're learning, this really cuts across culture, ethnicity, and we're learning a lot. And so we know that levels of accommodation are actually quite similar. But what constitutes accommodation, just like what constitutes an anxiety symptom, could be a little bit different. So for example, in a certain subset of American families, if your child is not almost extroverted, they seem socially impaired. If they are not, running for class president and making presentations and doing 2 extracurricular clubs where they speak in front of others and arranging play dates for the whole class, and then they seem almost socially impaired because at least some subsets of American culture really value putting yourself forward and letting your voice be heard and advocating for yourself. Right? These are terms that we value in many places. On the other hand, there are also cultures where much of that would be considered obnoxious, would be considered verging on the inappropriately self-centered or aggrandizing, and where valuing the group voice and subduing your own to a certain extent might be valued instead. Or what level of eye contact is considered appropriate could vary in one place versus another. And how much parents are involved in their child's lives in general could vary a lot from one place to another, right? Like should parents be scheduling their kids' play dates? Or should they be providing them with food and education and letting the kids work out most of the rest in terms of how to fill their time? So the point I'm trying to make is that although the levels of accommodation can be quite similar, what is considered an accommodation, what a parent feels is a child's anxiety symptom and how they're responding to it could also be different. And we are currently engaged in research. In fact, we have a paper that will hopefully be out soon, so I can't go into it until it's published, but it should be soon, on looking at ethnic differences even within the United States, for example, between Hispanic families and non-Hispanic families, which have different, somewhat different cultural contexts. And so I think it's a matter for ongoing research, but it really is an important one.
Yeah, thank you. And I imagine, I can only say this anecdotally, across different countries and cultures, there's different family structures. In some cultures, you'll have multi-generations, living together, and how involved are they? You have, parents, grandparents, sometimes great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, who are all in the same home, and how involved they're, super involved. And then, to the opposite extreme, you might have them really scattered out. You might have single parent homes, and how does that impact what accommodation looks like, even just from a logistical standpoint? So if a single parent is overwhelmed, and maybe they would accommodate more if they could, but they can't. All those factors are really fascinating. So
absolutely. Then you have places like in many typical families in China, for example, a child growing up today is either one of 2 or one of 1, and the child of 2 single child parents who are the children of 2 single child parents, and that is a very different cultural kind of context where you have so many adults all centered on this one child, right, as the progeny. It creates a very different context from maybe another context where you have many children growing up with almost generational gaps between siblings. And all of this can impact how families arrange their lives and distribute both tasks and responsibilities and et cetera. So yeah, I just think it's an important and really fascinating topic for research.
Sounds very, very interesting. Okay, so let's get into space here. And like I said before, I'll let people see this. This just came out, right?
It did.
It did. So, and this covers a lot of what's in space. I'll show it to people. They can see breaking free of child anxiety and OCD. So let's talk a little bit more about what are some of the components of space. So parent comes and they're interested in, they did the saliva test and they're interested in the parent focused treatment space. So what are some of these components that we're walking them through and helping them with?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for showing the book, and I'm glad to say it's back in stock after actually being sold out on the day that it was published. It's back in stock and can be found. So thanks for showing it. And I'll just say to parents that the book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, is really a guide to be able to implement the steps of space even on your own. You could be using it as you're working with a therapist, but it's really intended to give you, the parent, the ability to read and work through this book to help your child overcome these disorders, anxiety or OCD, even without the help of a therapist that you're meeting with directly.
Yeah, I can echo that. Reading it, it's very intuitive. It's very reader friendly. As a parent myself, and I can see it. Yeah, it's very easily applied for a parent.
Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of like understanding what actually happens in space, there are two main objectives in space. It really boils down to two kinds of changes that we're trying to help parents to make in their behavior. And to be really clear, everything in space is about changing the parent's own behavior. Here's a promise that I make to parents, both in the book and in my work with patients directly. I make a simple promise. I tell them early at the beginning of treatment, at no point in this therapy am I going to ask you to make your child do anything. At no point am I going to ask you to make your child not do anything. And this is incredibly liberating because so much of the work that has been done with parents in the past was about how do you get your child to do X? How do you get them to practice a skill, for example? Practice breathing. You know, deep breathing is a wonderful tool for relaxation, but trying to force somebody to relax when they don't want to is not very relaxing. You know, it's like standing and yelling at someone to fall asleep. They're not going to fall asleep. And trying to get your kid to practice relaxation or to practice exposure or to practice cognitive changes, those things are great if your child's on board. But what about when they're not? Now you have conflict. Now you have argument. Now you have stress. In space, you, the parent, don't have to make your kid do anything. All you have to do is change your own behavior in a way that doesn't require your child's agreement or lack of agreement. It's kind of irrelevant because you're just focused on changing your own behaviors. So there's really two of these changes that we want parents to make. The first one is to respond to their child's anxiety or their symptoms, stress, what have you, in what we call supportive ways. It's right there in the name of the treatment, right? The S stands for supportive. And this is a really big part of this therapy. Now, what do we mean by supportive? Well, I have a very simple formula for what is a supportive response. You're being supportive as a parent when you are showing your child two things. When you're showing them acceptance of their distress, that you get it, that you realize that this is hard for them. It can be as simple as saying to your kid something like, I know this is hard for you, or I know that scares you, or I know it makes you uncomfortable. Just showing them that you get and accept their distress. That's one part of the supportive message. The other part of the supportive message is showing your child confidence, that they actually can handle some distress. Now, again, you don't have to make them handle it. You just have to let them know that you believe they could, that you believe that they can handle, meaning tolerate, essentially survive being uncomfortable for a while. And that can be as simple as saying, I know this is hard for you, and I believe you can handle it. We want parents to be practicing making those supportive statements frequently. So in space, we'll think about how have you been responding to your child until now? What are the things you usually say? And let's make adjustments to those so they become more supportive statements. And then you're going to start using those statements a lot. This is an incredibly powerful intervention. Sounds like a small thing, right? Like I'm just saying this. It's actually an incredibly powerful intervention because you're holding up a mirror to your child that says, you're strong, you're capable. Now it's coming from a place of acceptance, but you're showing them, I believe you can handle it. So often, the ways in which we respond to anxious children actually give them the opposite message. Either we tell them that we don't accept it, like we tell them, you know, oh, don't be a baby, or it's not scary, or don't worry about it. You know, sometimes kind-hearted things, sometimes a little harsher things. Either way, we're not really showing acceptance, or we're not showing confidence. Like when we say about a kid, you know, they can't handle stress. She goes to pieces, she falls apart. We're giving these messages that you can't handle stress. Now, if you tell a child they can't handle something, what are they going to believe? Well, they're probably going to believe that they can't handle it. And so children are growing up feeling like I have to avoid being anxious at all costs. And that's almost dooming them to more anxiety over time. So the first of the two big objectives of space is increasing these supportive parental responses by practicing being supportive.
I can't tell you how many times I've repeated that since I don't know how long it's been since I've been to that, but it really, really, really resonated with me, and it really, really resonates with the, you know, the parents that I work with. It's, you know, it may sound simple to people, but like you said, it's very powerful, because once you lay that out for parents, and then you sort of like, what's the extreme of either of those, and they're like, oh, yeah. And then once they do it, it's you know, it's huge.
It is. It's absolutely huge. And you know, you shouldn't have an expectation that the first time you make a supportive statement, your child is gonna, you know, jump up and never be anxious again. That's not a reasonable expectation, but it doesn't mean that it's not working. It doesn't mean that it's not having an impact. And so practicing making these supportive statements is actually a big part of what space is about. The other big objective of space is the reduction in family accommodation. And this is incredibly important also. Now, we don't expect parents to just stop all their accommodations at once. Right? That would be incredibly hard for the child, and it would also be incredibly hard for the parent. So we actually take a much more gradual and much more kind of step-by-step approach, starting with really mapping out, how am I accommodating? Like helping parents to figure out what are the things that I'm doing that actually are accommodations. Whether you do that with your therapist or you do it with the book that has like a whole chapter on just understanding when am I accommodating, and making my own accommodation map. And then picking one specific thing to focus on. You don't need to just like stop everything. You just pick one specific thing to focus on, and then making a really clear plan for what is it that I'm going to do differently from now on. And breaking that down into the smallest details, right? Like so that I'm well prepared and I can succeed. And then letting my child know about the plan. Because we never do this by surprise. It would be a little bewildering for a child if they're used to, you know, maybe years you've been accommodating a certain way, then all of a sudden you're not, and they don't know why. A, they would be surprised, and B, what would they think of why you're doing it? Maybe they think you're mad at me or something like that, when it's the opposite. We're not doing this because we're mad at you. Right? You should never be angry at a child because they're anxious. If you do get angry at your kid sometimes because they're anxious, I get it. I do too. I'm a human being and you're a human being. But I would strive not to get angry at my child for their problem because they're not choosing to have that problem. Space is not about punishing kids. It's about helping them to overcome their problem in a loving, warm, and supportive way. So we're going to let them know about this plan in a loving, warm, and supportive way. And we have really clear guidelines for how to do that. And then we're going to start putting those plans into action and really reducing that accommodation. And it turns out from a lot of research that when parents can systematically and persistently make these two changes, become more supportive and less accommodating, children get better. Even if they never met with the therapist directly at all. They never had a medication at all. Children get better, and you can overcome even serious anxiety or OCD by working through this kind of a plan. And I think that there are few experiences that are more gratifying for a parent than having a child who had a real serious problem and helping them to overcome it.
And being a part of that.
And being a part of that, exactly. I think it's an amazing experience.
So can we, you know, for the, in the time we have, could we maybe describe a couple applications, maybe specific to social anxiety, of what an accommodation might look like, and then what a reducing accommodation for social anxiety might look like? And I'll throw in one more question there, because it says come up with parents, is that, let's say there are things that maybe they're not accommodating, but the child is not engaging and is sort of isolated. So there's no real accommodation to reduce.
Mhm.
And so, you know, get to that. But let's first talk about what maybe to articulate for people watching how it might look with social anxiety.
Sure. So remember that we'll start with being supportive. And so before we even try to reduce accommodation, we're going to spend a couple of weeks just really responding supportively when my child is upset, when they're anxious, when they're avoidant of something, not asking them to change it, but I'm saying to them, yeah, I get it. That would make you really uncomfortable. But I want you to know, I believe you can handle those feelings. And I'm like dripping that supportive message into their brain for a while before I even do anything else. Now, we're going to start with that mapping out of the accommodation. So let's figure out, how is this child being accommodated? There might be 10 different things that we're doing. There might be 3 different things. That process of mapping is really important to get a good picture of it. Then we'll pick one specific thing. So for example, right, let's try to bring this to life. Let's take the example I gave before about the child who won't speak for themselves in different settings and maybe won't order at restaurants, for example, okay? Now, if we were like using the child-based treatment mindset, right, what would we say? We'd say, how do we get this kid to order for themselves? And so maybe we would make a plan that says, we're going to go to a restaurant and you're going to practice ordering for yourself. And if you do order for yourself, maybe you get a prize, and etc. Now, that sounds great in theory until you get to the restaurant and the child is like, no way, I can't order for myself. And I never said that I would. You said that I would. And even if I did say that I would, it was just to get you off my back. And now I'm not doing it. And now we have a parent who's frustrated, so they start applying pressure, and it's like, God damn it, yeah, you're gonna order for yourself. The child is like, oh no, I won't. And now we're angry, then we storm out of the restaurant, go home, come back to the therapy and say, this was an awful plan, you're a bad therapist. Okay, that's the bad scenario that we want to avoid. How do we avoid that? We avoid it in space by making our plan just about the parent. And so our plan never says this child is going to order at the restaurant. We don't know what the child is going to do, and we don't get to decide. What we can do is make a plan that says, I know it's hard for this kid to order, but I have confidence that they can, so I'm not going to order for them. That's what it means to focus on the accommodation. And I let the child know in advance. From now on, when we go to restaurants, we know that it's hard for you, but we believe you can handle it, and we don't think it helps you when we always order for you. We don't think we're really helping you overcome this problem that way. So from now on, we're not going to order for you. We may even break it down into smaller steps and say we're not going to order a drink for you, but we'll still order food, because some parents will want to start smaller. Or we won't order dessert, so that maybe A, the child still gets to eat their meal, and B, maybe they're a little bit motivated to get that sweet dessert at the end of the meal. Either way, they'll go to the restaurant, and now if the child doesn't order, that's okay. There's no argument, there's no fight, because we never said you would. We simply say, well, okay, maybe next time you will. And we go home. And the next time we try again, and we don't know if the change in the child's behavior is going to come on the second time or the third time or the fourth time, but we do know that in most cases, when parents stick to these plans, the child ends up getting better, because at the end of treatment, we are measuring child change. And when we talk, when we think about like clinical trial research supporting the efficacy of space, we have data telling us that the child is changing, even though we never tried to force it on them. And so that's an example of what it might look like to actually implement this.
That's great. That's a great example. And initially, I like how you said, like, you can start small, because initially parents, you want me to not feed my child? What do you want me to do to my? And it is it's okay. First of all, there's leftovers in the fridge. I mean, like when they come home, they they can eat. You have food in the house, and then you can tritate it. You can make it smaller where you're not ordering everything. So that's a great example. And then I guess one more question here to wrap up. I'm sure we can go on for hours, but when it comes to something in a child, let's say when you mentioned like play dates before, or participating in class, and so I'm not necessarily accommodating, and they say, okay, no, fine, no, I'm not gonna call anyone, I'm not gonna make any play dates, I'm not gonna talk in class, I'm not gonna and it might affect my class participation grade or whatever it is, I'm just not gonna do it. So how would you guide a parent in those types of scenarios?
Yeah, so first of all, it is important, though, to never skip that step of really mapping out the accommodations, because what we discover is that in many cases, parents are facilitating those avoidances. Even though it seems like it's just the child, not wanting to do, sometimes we have the parent calling the teacher and saying, hey, please don't call on my kid in class because it would make them anxious. Or, my child has a question about the homework, can you tell him what the whatever was, because the child is anxious about reaching out directly. Or we're arranging family life around this child's choices about the play dates, for example. And so a lot of times, looking a little bit deeper, we'll see that even when it seems like it's just my kid not doing things, there's like a cascade of effects in which the parents are involved. And that careful mapping process can often surface those, because I'm still going to stand by what I said, which is we want to keep the focus in space on what the parent is doing. As soon as we make it about how do I make my child go on a play date, how do I make my child participate better, I'm giving up something really powerful about space, right? My ability to succeed regardless of how my child is going to respond. And I don't want to give that up. And so I would keep the focus, but I think a lot of times really thinking about it carefully will show that parents are involved. Now, even if we are facing a situation where there really aren't parent involvement, there's still the support piece. And so think about how you're responding to those situations when your child said, like, they could have a play date, but they say, no, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to call, right? You said so-and-so wants to have a play date with you. Are you going to do it? And they say, no. How are you responding? Now, very often, the way that we try to respond is persuasion. This is the typical kind of thing. Even though I've tried this like a million times with the same kid before, I never give up, right? It's like it hasn't worked 1,000 times, but maybe it'll work the 1,001st. And it's like, why? But it could be fun. Well, don't you think it would be awesome if you did? But why? They're going to be hurt. And if you never agree to the play date, they're not going to continue being your friends. You're going to be left alone. Do you want to be alone in the end? And that's the parents' fears coming out, right? And there's like all these attempts at persuasion. And the child just sort of puts on his like mental, helmet and flak jacket, and children, especially children with social anxiety, they're pretty good at like tuning out all of these messages that they don't want to hear and make them uncomfortable. They're still left feeling bad about themselves, but it doesn't really lead to a lot of change. These are opportunities to practice support, to practice giving that message of, actually, I get it, why you don't want to do the play date. You know what? Meeting with kids can be really stressful. It can be embarrassing to think about, what if I say the wrong thing? Or I get it, it actually does make you really uncomfortable. There's a lot of kids who haven't had that acceptance message in a long time. And you talk to parents and sometimes they'll say, well, no, they know that I get it. Maybe, but you know what? If you actually tell them, then they know it for sure. And if you don't, then we don't know what they know. And hearing it said in a calm kind of way, actually, I really get it. This could be really uncomfortable. But I want you to know, I think you can handle those uncomfortable feelings. And I just leave it at that. And so I'm not locked into this power struggle with my kid. I'm not doing the arm wrestling. And it actually makes it easier for them to consider taking a small step forward. Because when I'm constantly pressuring my kid to do something, then them doing it feels like a concession. It feels like a surrender almost. Like I have to climb down off this tall tree that I've, gotten up on. If I acknowledge that I don't have the control over their behavior, and I give up on the illusion that I can make them do something, then I can just be supportive. And that can still be a powerful thing, even if we don't see a lot of accommodations. But actually, it's far more likely that there are accommodations than that there aren't. And if you don't have them in that area, find an accommodation in a different area of the social life and focus on that.
That's great. Thank you. So I think I lied about that being the last question, because so to continue with that, so how old could you do this? Up until what? Because there are plenty of adolescents, young adults, people in their 20s, maybe still living at home. How up? What have you seen? What have you noticed? What could we do this until?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Let me actually start from the young side and go up from there, because the youngest sample in a clinical trial of space to date was actually preschoolers. And so we had one study, this was done not at Yale, but I was involved in the study, where the children were like 2, 3, 4 years old. And I mention it partly to tell people that you can do space with very young children, with the parents of very young children, partly because there's a real opportunity for intervention early that may prevent the real escalation in anxiety that will come likely over the next few years, right? You can't really do cognitive behavioral therapy with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. It's a real challenge, I would say. That would be hard, but you can do space, and you might be able to head off a trajectory early. And so I mention it for that. We have a lot of research in school-age children, 6, 7, 8, 12, 13, 14, etc. We have a lot of clinical experience doing it with older adolescents as well, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds. We have not done a clinical trial focused on 17-year-olds. There's actually one study that will go that high that is just about to start, but it's not done yet, so can't speak to results. But we've done it lots of times clinically with outside of research. And you definitely can do it with older adolescents as well. And then, picking up on what you said, we actually have a version of space that is aimed at adult children or parents of adult children. But specifically, it's aimed at parents of adult children who are not transitioning to independent adulthood successfully. Either they don't transition at all, or they sort of make an aborted attempt to transition to adulthood and then are back at home. This is what some people call sometimes failure to launch, a reference to a somewhat dumb movie from years ago. And what failure to launch really means is that kind of highly dependent adult child who's not working, not in higher education, not in training, basically not really doing any productive endeavors, usually living either at home or at their parents' expense somewhere, and essentially not functioning as an adult. And this is actually an incredibly common phenomenon, and it is one that is severely underaddressed. There are very few resources available for parents of highly dependent adult children. There's almost nothing out there. And so what we have found is that you can take many of the principles of space and translate them into a parent-based treatment to improve the functioning of these children. We did one clinical trial already. We're actually currently doing another clinical trial, and families who are interested, or providers who are interested, could refer families to the Yale Child Study Center, even to me, and they could potentially participate in that.
Is that in person or is that virtual?
Virtual.
So they could be anywhere.
They could be anywhere in the US, and I think I'm not sure if we got or are seeking approval to actually extend even beyond the US, but at least anywhere in the US, yes, for sure.
Okay, that's amazing.
By the way, I don't even say young adults when I talk about this problem anymore. Many people say young adults. I've dropped the young from the description because there's no natural end point to this. The years just pass. It's like one year after another. When your kid is 23 and stuck at home, they did one semester of college, then they came home and they haven't done anything for a year and a half. You don't imagine that you'll be in the same boat 10, 15, 20 years later. But time goes by. And a year of non-function predicts more non-function. It doesn't predict a sudden change into productivity and function. And so I really recommend trying to intervene sooner and not assuming that this is going to end, because I've worked with parents of people who are no longer in their 20s or even 30s. And if you think about the toll that this can take on elderly parents who are aging, who are concerned about who will care for this adult child when they are no longer there, whose finances are limited, but they're supporting an adult child long beyond what they expected to be doing, the emotional, financial, and even health toll is very serious.
Right. Wow. Thank you so much. This was, I found it very meaningful. I'm sure everyone watching. So how could people, well, you mentioned this study, how could people be in contact regarding that? Also, for providers out there who are interested, I know the trainings get filled up probably faster than a Beyonce concert. And so, how could providers or clinicians, whoever's out there who wants to sign up for a training, and where people can find the book? What's the best way to connect for all those?
Yeah, so the best place to go for resources about space is to visit the website for space, which is spacetreatment.net. So www.spacetreatment.net. And there you can find many resources. There is information on training workshops, and you can sign up to be notified by email when the next workshop is scheduled. If you're interested in training, you should definitely sign up for that email, because as you just pointed out, they fill up long before I can post them to the website itself. And so typically, honestly, the past few have been, for the past year, they've been filling up within like an hour of when I send the email. So if you are interested, sign up for the email notice. And then when you see the email notice, try to register really quickly. The other things on the website, though, there's many resources, including links to articles, both professional, like research articles, and also articles in the lay media, like The Atlantic or CNN or NPR or outlets like that. There are videos. Maybe this video will be posted there once it's ready, and audio podcasts and lots of things like that, as well as links to the books. And so you can find that book, Breaking Free, and a couple of other books as well on the website. And other things that are there, there's a list of space-trained providers. So if you are a patient, if you're a parent, and you're looking for somebody in your area who could do space, you can search there by your country or your state and find somebody in your area. There are forums for parents to talk with each other and for professionals to talk with each other. And I'll also mention that space, as of March 2021, is now also on Facebook, because I'm not very social media savvy. It took this long. But if you go on Facebook, you can just search for it, or I think it's like Facebook, like /space treatments, but with an S at the end, like space treatments, plural. So you can find it and follow on Facebook as well. So that's the best place to go for resources, really.
And for that study that you mentioned, to participate also on the website?
For the study, yes, you could go also on the website and then contact me. There's like a make contact kind of email sort of link, and reach out to us like that.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Well, thank you. Actually, in the context of that study, let me mention, I'll say one email address, just in case anybody writes it down, which is the person who's actually kind of leading that. The person on my team who's leading that is a doctor by the name of Uri Berger, and his email is uri, uri.berger, B-E-R-G-E-R, @yale.edu. So people can just email him directly about that study as well. Yeah, anyway.
Got it.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure and an honor to be on.